The story most of us learned about the Americas is neat, linear, and reassuring. A handful of hunters follow game across a frozen land bridge at the end of the last ice age. They spread south. They multiply. They adapt. Thousands of years later, the continent is still largely untouched, waiting in silence, until one October morning in 1492, European sails break the horizon, and history, as we are told, truly begins. It is a story that fits comfortably in textbooks, a story with clean dates, clear beginnings, and a satisfying sense of order. And yet, when we look closely, the story begins to fray, not at the edges, but at its core. Across the Americas, from deserts to jungles, coastlines to high mountains, there are places, objects, and dates that refuse to stay inside this narrative. They do not shout. They do not announce themselves as revolutions. They simply exist, quietly, stubbornly, asking questions the official timeline was never designed to answer. How old is human presence in the Americas really? Who arrived here, and how? And what if the continent was never isolated at all? These are not new questions. They have been asked for over a century. But time and again, they have been set aside, minimized, or explained away. Not always because the evidence was weak, but because the implications were uncomfortable. Because once you loosen one thread, the entire fabric begins to shift. The idea that the Americas were a late chapter in human history, populated last, developed last, discovered last, has long shaped how the world sees this half of the planet. It shaped colonial ambition. It shaped scientific assumptions. It shaped which questions were considered reasonable and which were quietly discouraged. Yet beneath the surface, the ground tells a different story. In the sands of New Mexico, footprints now dated to over 20,000 years ago press into ancient lake beds, frozen in time long before the so-called first Americans were supposed to exist. In South America, fire pits and stone tools challenge dates once thought impossible. In North America, cities rose and fell without stone walls or writing, yet governed tens of thousands of people with precision and ritual complexity. These discoveries did not arrive all at once. They emerged slowly, often reluctantly, forced into view by new dating methods, satellite imaging, genetic analysis, and underwater exploration. And with each one, the timeline stretched, not just backward, but outward. Because the deeper we look, the harder it becomes to maintain the idea of isolation. Plants appear in places they should not be. Technologies resemble others across oceans. Myths echo one another across continents, and sometimes, even historical records, written not in legend but in ink, describe voyages that official history barely acknowledges. This is where discomfort begins. Because history, like any human system, prefers simplicity. Clear origins, clear boundaries, clear heroes. A complex past is harder to manage. If people reached the Americas earlier than we thought, then migration was not a single event, but a series of movements. If contact occurred across oceans, then discovery was not a European monopoly. And if civilizations rose here with knowledge rivaling or exceeding their old world counterparts, then the long-held hierarchy of advanced and primitive collapses. What replaces it is something far more unsettling and far more interesting. A world where ancient humans were capable navigators, where oceans were not walls, but corridors, where knowledge did not move in one direction, but many. This does not require lost super-civilizations or visitors from the stars. It requires only one thing, that we take the evidence seriously, even when it complicates the story. And that is precisely what has so often failed to happen. When discoveries challenged the accepted narrative, they were frequently labeled anomalies. When anomalies accumulated, they were reclassified as errors. When errors persisted, they were ignored. Not through a single conspiracy, not through secret meetings or hidden orders, but through something quieter and more human. Academic caution, institutional inertia, fear of professional isolation. When a model becomes dominant, it does not fall easily. It becomes defended, not because it is perfect, but because too much depends on it. Careers, reputations, entire frameworks of interpretation. So evidence that pushes beyond accepted boundaries is often met not with curiosity, but resistance, not always openly, sometimes simply through silence. This silence has consequences. It creates gaps in the public story, and gaps invite speculation. When mainstream scholarship hesitates to engage openly with unresolved questions, others step in, sometimes responsibly, sometimes recklessly. The result is a landscape where solid evidence, weak evidence, and pure imagination blur together, leaving many people unsure what to trust. Our goal here is not to replace one dogma with another. It is to slow down, to separate what is known from what is debated, and to listen carefully to the things that do not fit. Because patterns matter. When similar questions appear across unrelated sites, across vast distances, across different disciplines, archaeology, genetics, geology, mythology, that pattern deserves attention. Not belief, attention. This journey is not about proving a single theory. It is about recognizing that the history of the Americas may be far deeper, far older, and far more interconnected than the version we inherited. A story not of emptiness, but of movement, not of isolation, but of contact, not of sudden beginnings, but of forgotten continuities. And so we begin at the margins, where myth, archaeology, and missing evidence intersect, at a place where oral tradition collides with excavation, where folklore refuses to fade, and where the official record leaves uncomfortable gaps. Our first stop is a shadow in the Nevada desert. The Nevada desert is a place where stories linger. The land is dry, open, and deceptively empty, a landscape that seems hostile to memory. Yet for the northern Paiute people, one particular place has never been silent. For generations, they told of a cavern in the mountains, a place of fire, death, and an ancient enemy. They called them the Si-Te-Ka. According to Paiute oral tradition, the Si-Te-Ka were a race unlike ordinary humans. They were said to be tall, pale-skinned, and marked by reddish hair. More importantly, they were remembered as violent outsiders, cannibals who preyed upon the surrounding tribes. The stories describe long conflicts, ambushes, and finally, a desperate last stand. The Si-Te-Ka were driven into a cave. The tribes sealed the entrance and set it ablaze, filling the cavern with smoke until no one inside remained alive. For centuries, this was understood as legend, a moral story, a warning, a memory shaped by time. But legends have a way of becoming complicated when the ground begins to speak. In 1911, at the edge of the Humboldt Sink near the town of Lovelock, two miners entered that same cave, not in search of history, but fertilizer. Bat guano, compressed over thousands of years, was a valuable agricultural resource, and Lovelock Cave was filled with it. As the miners dug deeper, their tools struck more than compacted droppings and stone. They uncovered baskets woven with astonishing precision, decoys carved to mimic ducks in mid-flight, fishing nets, tools, sandals and artifacts preserved by the cave's dry conditions as if time itself had paused. It quickly became clear that this was no ordinary site. By 1912, the University of California sent archaeologists to conduct a formal excavation. The official reports documented what scholars expected to find: a long record of indigenous habitation, artifacts dating back thousands of years, and human remains consistent with known populations of the region. But alongside these reports, another story began to circulate. Miners, local witnesses, and early visitors described something that never appeared in the published conclusions. They spoke of unusually large skeletons, of mummified remains with distinctly red hair, of oversized sandals, some said to be nearly 15 inches long, of handprints impressed into cave surfaces that appeared far larger than those of modern humans. This is where the narrative splits. On one side stands the official archaeological record. It explains the red hair as a natural chemical effect of decomposition, dark hair turning reddish over time. It states that the skeletons fell within normal height ranges, and that any reports to the contrary were exaggerations born of frontier storytelling. On the other side is the persistence of the oral tradition and the uncomfortable absence of the most sensational remains described by the earliest witnesses. No giant skeletons are available for modern study. No oversized skulls remain on public record. No conclusive evidence exists that could settle the question definitively. They are simply gone. For some, this absence is proof of nothing more than rumor collapsing under scrutiny. For others, it raises a more troubling possibility that not all discoveries are treated equally once they challenge established narratives. The Smithsonian Institution often enters the conversation here, not as a proven villain, but as a symbol. Accusations claim that remains inconsistent with accepted human history were quietly removed, archived, or destroyed to preserve a fragile timeline. There is no document that confirms such a cover-up. There is no photograph that resolves the debate, but there is a silence where evidence should be. And silence, in archaeology, can be as telling as presence. Lovelock Cave occupies an uneasy space between myth and material culture. The artifacts are real. The cave is real. The oral history predates the excavation by centuries. Yet the physical proof required to validate or dismiss the most extraordinary claims no longer exists. Which leaves us with a question that echoes far beyond Nevada. When oral traditions describe events that archaeology later partially confirms, but the most disruptive evidence vanishes, how should history respond? Do we dismiss the story entirely, or do we acknowledge that something may be missing? Lovelock does not prove the existence of giants, but it does reveal a fault line between what is remembered, what is recorded, and what is allowed to remain. And that fault line runs deep, leading us away from desert caves and into far older ground, where stone and fire suggest a human presence in the Americas so ancient it strains the limits of our species itself. If Lovelock Cave unsettles us because its evidence is missing, there are other sites that disturb the timeline for the opposite reason. Their evidence is still there, embedded in stone, layered in ash, locked beneath sediments that refuse to cooperate with the official story. To understand why these places provoke such intense resistance, we need to move away from legends and into the language archaeology trusts most: fire, stone, and time. In the northeast of Brazil, within the rugged landscape of Serra da Capivara National Park, lies a cluster of rock shelters known as Pedra Furada. At first glance, the site appears unremarkable. Cliff overhangs, painted walls, scattered stones. But beneath those shelters, in carefully excavated layers, archaeologist Nied Guidon and her team uncovered something that would ignite one of the fiercest debates in modern archaeology. Charcoal. Not scattered randomly, but concentrated in hearth-like formations. Fire pits arranged in patterns that strongly resemble human occupation. Surrounding them were crude stone objects, flakes, choppers, and scrapers made from quartzite. The dates attached to these layers were explosive. Radiocarbon analysis placed some of the charcoal at over 30,000 years old. Others pushed beyond 40,000. In the most controversial layers, dates approached 50,000 years. If correct, this would mean humans were present in South America tens of thousands of years before the Clovis culture, long before the accepted peopling of the Americas, and alarmingly close to the period when Homo sapiens had only just begun spreading beyond Africa. The response from the archaeological establishment was swift and severe. The tools, critics argued, were not tools at all. They were geofacts, stones fractured naturally by rockfall, erosion, or pressure. The charcoal, they claimed, was the residue of natural wildfires that swept through the region long before humans arrived. The case seemed closed, but Guidon and her team pushed back, not with speculation, but with pattern. The stone objects were not scattered randomly across the site. They clustered around the charcoal concentrations in ways consistent with living spaces. The fractures on the stones showed repeated directional force, not the chaotic breakage typical of falling rock. And above these contested layers, the cave walls bore rock art, some of it dated to around 30,000 years ago, depicting animals, hunting scenes, and ritualized figures. Fire, tools, art, and spatial organization. Separately, each could be dismissed. Together, they formed an uncomfortable picture. Pedro Ferrada was not alone. In central Mexico, near the city of Puebla, lies the Valsequillo Basin. During geological surveys in the 1960s and 70s, researchers uncovered stone spear points embedded in sediment layers alongside the fossilized remains of extinct megafauna, mastodons and ancient camels. This alone was troubling, but the real shock came from the dating. Geologist Virginia Steen McIntyre applied multiple independent methods to the volcanic layers surrounding the artifacts, including uranium series dating and fission track analysis. The results converged on an age that seemed impossible, around 250,000 years old. Not only pre-Clovis, not only pre-modern humans. At that time, Homo sapiens did not exist as we know them. The implication was not simply early migration, it was the presence of another kind of human in the Americas. The scientific reaction was brutal. Steen McIntyre's findings were blocked from publication for years. Funding evaporated. Her conclusions were labeled impossible, not incorrect. And when evidence is declared impossible, it is no longer debated, it is buried. A similar fate met the Calico Early Man site in California's Mojave Desert. There, under the support of paleoanthropologist Louis Leakey, the same scientist who helped establish Africa as the cradle of humanity, researchers identified crude stone tools in deposits dated to nearly 200,000 years ago. Despite Leakey's reputation, the site was dismissed. The tools were declared geofacts. The debate ended not with refutation, but with disinterest. These sites share a common pattern. They do not merely push dates back. They break the framework. Monteverde and White Sands forced archaeology to accept that modern humans arrived earlier than expected. But Pedro Ferrada, Valsequillo, and Calico suggest something far more destabilizing. That the first intelligent beings to shape the Americas may not have been us, not Homo sapiens alone. And that possibility strikes at the foundation of a linear human story. Rather than exploring this implication openly, the field retreated. The sites became footnotes, cautionary tales used to warn young researchers about the dangers of stepping outside accepted boundaries. The resistance was not fueled by evidence alone. It was fueled by risk. To accept such antiquity would require rewriting migration models, evolutionary assumptions, and long-held certainties about human uniqueness. It would mean acknowledging a past populated by multiple kinds of humans whose traces may have been erased by time, climate, and catastrophe. And so these places linger in limbo, not disproven, not accepted, simply avoided. They are the fault lines beneath the timeline, places where the ground insists on telling a story older than the one we are prepared to hear. And as we move forward in time, those fault lines do not disappear. They rise to the surface again, this time not in stone tools and fire pits, but in colossal monuments, star-aligned cities, and civilizations whose sophistication appears to arrive fully formed, carrying echoes of something much older. When the timeline fractures at its deepest levels, the damage does not stay buried. It resurfaces, subtly at first, then unmistakably, in the civilizations that rise thousands of years later. Cultures that seem to appear already mature, already complex, already carrying knowledge that has no clear origin story. Nowhere is this more evident than in Mesoamerica. From the outside, its history is often presented as a straightforward progression, small farming villages gradually evolving into cities, cities into states, and states into empires. But when we look closely, the earliest chapters of this story refuse to behave like a beginning. They behave like an inheritance. Our journey into this inherited knowledge begins along the humid Gulf Coast of Mexico, where around 1600 BCE a civilization emerged that modern scholars would later call the Olmec. They were not preceded by long centuries of trial and error. They arrived with monumental architecture, complex ritual systems, long-distance trade networks, and possibly the first writing system in the Americas. San Lorenzo, La Venta, ceremonial centers laid out with intention, not improvisation. But the most arresting legacy they left behind is carved in stone. 17 colossal heads, each weighing up to 50 tons, quarried from volcanic basalt in the Tuxtla Mountains and transported across rivers and swamps without wheels, draft animals, or metal tools. The logistics alone challenge our assumptions. How does a society with no beasts of burden move stoneheads weighing more than a modern tank across 70 miles of difficult terrain? The answer is usually framed as ingenuity and labour, and that is likely part of it. But the deeper mystery lies not in how they were moved, but in why they were made. Each head is a portrait, not symbolic, not stylized into abstraction. They are individualized, expressive, unmistakably human, and their features have been controversial since the moment they were rediscovered. Broad noses, full lips, helmet-like headgear. For over a century, observers have remarked that these faces do not resemble the later populations of Mesoamerica. This observation predates modern debates and has appeared in academic descriptions, museum notes, and traveler accounts since the 19th century. From this emerged one of the most explosive ideas in American archaeology, that the Olmec heads may depict people of African origin. The hypothesis gained its most famous advocate in the 20th century with the work of historian Ivan van Sertima, who argued that transatlantic contact between West Africa and the Americas occurred long before Columbus. He pointed to the heads as visual evidence, but also cited metallurgical analysis, linguistic parallels, botanical transfers, and cultural similarities between Mesoamerica and Africa. Mainstream archaeology rejects this interpretation. The prevailing explanation is that the heads represent local rulers rendered in a naturalistic style unfamiliar to later cultures. The facial features, they argue, fall within the diversity of indigenous populations, and any resemblance to Africans is coincidental. Yet the question lingers. Why did the mother culture of Mesoamerica immortalize its leaders in a style so distinct from the civilizations that followed? Why do these monumental portraits stand at the very beginning of the region's history, not the end? The Olmec vanish around 400 BCE, not in fire or conquest, but in fragmentation. Their ceremonial centers are abandoned, their influence disperses, but they leave behind more than stone heads. They leave a template, art styles, religious symbols, urban planning concepts. Most importantly, they leave a worldview, one that blends the heavens, the underworld, and human authority into a single cosmic system. The civilizations that rise after them inherit this framework fully formed, and that inheritance becomes unmistakable when we move east, into the jungles of the Yucatan Peninsula, where the Maya transformed the Olmec legacy into something mathematically precise, astronomically obsessive, and spiritually vast. The Maya do not merely track time, they map it. Their long count calendar measures cycles spanning millions of years. They independently invent the concept of zero. They record dynastic histories with a writing system more complex than any other in the pre-Columbian Americas. Yet even this brilliance feels sudden. The Maya do not begin with crude astronomy and slowly refine it. From their earliest inscriptions, their understanding of planetary cycles, eclipses, and solstices is already exact. This raises an unsettling possibility. What if Mesoamerican civilization did not grow in isolation from ignorance to knowledge, but emerged from the shadow of something older? Not necessarily a lost super-civilization, not necessarily visitors from the sky, but a deep human past whose traces were broken, fragmented, and inherited rather than invented. As the Maya cities rise, their architecture reaches upward toward the stars, and downward into the earth. And in that vertical axis, between sky and underworld, the mysteries deepen. Because to understand what the Maya believed, we must descend into darkness, into water, into the places they believed the world itself was born. To understand the Maya, we have to abandon the idea that their cities were built only on the surface of the world. For them, reality was vertical. Above was the sky, the realm of gods, stars, and cycles of time. Below was the underworld, a vast, watery, and dangerous domain where creation and destruction began. And between these two extremes stood humanity, tasked with maintaining balance. This belief was not symbolic, it was architectural. Beneath the limestone crust of the Yucatan Peninsula lies a hidden world. A honeycomb of caves, tunnels, and sinkholes formed by water-dissolving stone over tens of thousands of years. These sinkholes, known as cenotes, were the only reliable sources of fresh water in a region with no rivers. But to the Maya, cenotes were far more than wells. They were portals, gateways to Xibalba, the underworld, a place of gods, ancestors, trials, and rebirth. Offerings were cast into their depths, ceremonies were performed at their edges, and in times of crisis, lives were sacrificed to appease the forces believed to dwell below. For centuries, this was understood largely through myth and ethnohistory. Then the caves began to reveal their secrets. Modern underwater exploration has shown that many cenotes were once dry caves during the last ice age, when sea levels were dramatically lower. As the glaciers melted and oceans rose, these caverns flooded, preserving whatever lay inside. What divers found was not random debris. Deep within these submerged systems were stone altars, carved stairways, platforms shaped by human hands. In places like Sac Acton and other cave networks, archaeologists discovered structures built far beyond the reach of daylight, places that could only have been constructed when the caves were dry, thousands of years before the Maya civilization formally emerged. Even more unsettling were the bones. In Hoyo Negro, a massive underwater chamber, divers discovered the skeleton of a young woman dated to around 13,000 years ago, one of the oldest genetically confirmed humans in the Americas. Her remains lay alongside extinct Ice Age animals, frozen in a moment just before the world changed. She did not belong to the Maya. She belonged to something far older. And yet, centuries later, the Maya would treat these same underground spaces as sacred, dangerous, and central to their cosmology, as if they had inherited a memory of their importance. This inheritance becomes impossible to ignore at Chichen Itza. At the heart of the city stands El Castillo, the Pyramid of Kukulkan. It is often described as a solar calendar, and rightly so. On the equinoxes, shadows create the illusion of a serpent descending the staircase, a masterpiece of astronomical design. But what lies beneath it is just as important. Directly under the pyramid is a cenote, not nearby, not adjacent, directly beneath. The entire structure was deliberately built over a portal to the underworld. This was not symbolic coincidence, it was cosmic engineering. The pyramid connected sky, earth, and abyss into a single, vertical axis, a place where rituals could influence the heavens while feeding the underworld below. This pattern repeats across the Maya world. Cities aligned to celestial events, temples constructed above caves, sacred roads leading toward water-filled voids. The Maya were not merely star watchers. They were mediators between realms. And this brings us to one of the most controversial artifacts ever discovered in the Americas. Deep within the Temple of the Inscriptions at Palenque lies the tomb of Kinich Janab Pakal, Pakal the Great. When archaeologists uncovered his sarcophagus lid in 1952, they expected a conventional funerary scene. What they found ignited a debate that has never fully cooled. The carving depicts Pakal at the moment of death, or transformation, falling into the jaws of the underworld monster. Above him rises the world tree, connecting the three cosmic levels. A celestial bird perches at its crown. This is the orthodox interpretation, and it is valid. But to the modern eye, the imagery is unsettlingly familiar. Pakal appears seated. His hands grasp objects resembling controls. His foot presses against what looks like a pedal. Flames or energy seem to burst behind him. It is an illusion, almost certainly. And yet, it is a powerful one. The image became an icon, not because it proves advanced technology, but because it exposes a deeper truth. The Maya visual language encoded complex cosmology so densely that it invites misinterpretation by modern minds trained to see machines instead of myths. But here is the more important question. Why was Maya cosmology so elaborate in the first place? Why did a civilization without metal tools, wheels, or draft animals develop a worldview so mathematically precise, astronomically aligned, and architecturally encoded that it rivals the symbolic systems of Egypt and Mesopotamia? The answer may lie in continuity. The Maya did not invent their universe from nothing. They inherited it. From the Olmec, from earlier peoples whose names are lost, from ancestors who lived in a world before rising seas swallowed caves and coastlines. What we are seeing is not the birth of complexity, but its preservation, a memory carried forward through ritual, myth, and stone. And as we move forward in time, out of the jungles and into the vast central highlands of Mexico, that memory becomes darker, more rigid, and more terrifying. Because when cosmic balance fails, civilizations do not simply fade. They collapse, often violently. And the next city we encounter was so immense, so powerful, that even its name was forgotten. A city the Aztecs believed could only have been built by gods. Long before the Aztecs ruled the Valley of Mexico, before their myths, their gods, and their wars, there was a city so vast and so imposing that later civilizations refused to believe humans had built it. They called it Teotihuacan, not a name given by its inhabitants, a name given by the Aztecs centuries later. It means the place where the gods were born. By the time the Aztecs encountered its ruins, Teotihuacan had already been abandoned for hundreds of years. Its true name, its language, and even the identity of its builders were lost. What remained was scale, overwhelming, inhuman scale. At its height, around 400 CE, Teotihuacan was one of the largest cities on Earth. More than 200,000 people lived there. Its urban grid covered over 8 square miles. Its main avenue stretched for miles, aligned with astronomical precision. This was not an organic city that grew slowly. It was planned, from the very beginning. The Avenue of the Dead slices through the city like a ceremonial spine, flanked by temples, plazas, and elite compounds. At its northern end rises the Pyramid of the Moon. Near its center stands the Pyramid of the Sun, the third largest pyramid ever built, containing more than 1 million cubic meters of stone. And yet, for all this monumentality, Teotihuacan feels strangely impersonal. There are no royal tombs, no carved portraits of kings, no inscriptions boasting of conquests or dynasties. Unlike the Maya, who filled their cities with the names and faces of rulers, Teotihuacan erased the individual. Power here was collective, anonymous, almost bureaucratic. Its apartment compounds housed extended families in standardized layouts, decorated with murals depicting gods, animals, and ritual processions. Specialized districts mass-produced obsidian tools, pottery, and luxury goods for trade networks that reached across Mesoamerica. Teotihuacan did not just dominate culturally, it dominated economically. Its control of obsidian, the razor-sharp volcanic glass essential for weapons and tools, gave it leverage over entire regions. Influence flowed outward, not always through conquest, but through dependency. Yet beneath this order lay something darker. Excavations at the Pyramid of the Moon and the Temple of the Feathered Serpent revealed mass human sacrifices on a scale that shocked even seasoned archaeologists. Dozens, then hundreds of bound bodies were found buried beneath the structures, many of them foreign warriors, their hands tied, their bodies arranged in ritual patterns. This was not sporadic violence, it was systemic. At the Temple of the Feathered Serpent alone, over 200 sacrificed individuals were interred during its construction. Their deaths were not punishment. They were offerings, payments made to sanctify the city's cosmic machinery. Teotihuacan was not just a city. It was a ritual engine, and engines demand fuel. For centuries the system held. The city thrived. Its influence spread. Then, suddenly, it ended. Around 550 CE, something catastrophic occurred, but it was not an invasion. The destruction was surgical. The ceremonial core, the temples, palaces, and elite structures along the Avenue of the Dead was systematically looted and burned. Murals were defaced, statues shattered, symbols of authority obliterated. Yet the residential compounds of ordinary people were largely untouched. This was not conquest from without, it was rebellion from within. Something broke the social contract. Scholars debate the trigger. A prolonged drought may have strained food supplies. Volcanic winters, like the global climate shock of 536 CE, could have disrupted agriculture. Faith in the ruling ideology may have collapsed when the gods failed to deliver stability. Whatever the cause, the people turned on the system. They dismantled the sacred core of their world and walked away. Teotihuacan was not conquered. It was abandoned. And in its ruins, a warning lingered that even the most carefully planned civilization, even one aligned to the stars and fueled by ritual power, could collapse overnight if balance failed. The civilizations that followed did not forget Teotihuacan. They inherited its gods, its symbols, its fears, and they learned one lesson above all others. Power must be visible. Power must be personalized. Power must be feared. In the vacuum left by Teotihuacan's fall, new cultures rose, less anonymous, more militaristic, more obsessed with divine kingship. The cycle accelerated. And as we climb into the mountains of Oaxaca, we encounter a civilization that reshaped the earth itself to project authority, one that carved conquest and sacrifice into stone. A city built not in a valley, but on top of a mountain. And like all the great powers before it, it too would vanish. High above the valleys of southern Mexico, where mountain ridges cut sharply into the sky, a civilization quite literally remade the land to announce its power. They were the Zapotec, and their capital, Monte Alban, was not founded, it was imposed. Around 500 BCE, Zapotec engineers chose a mountaintop overlooking 3 fertile valleys. Then they did something extraordinary. They flattened it. Entire ridgelines were carved away to create a vast artificial plateau, a ceremonial plaza suspended between earth and sky. This was not a defensive necessity, it was a statement. From Monte Alban, the Zapotec could see and be seen by everyone below. For over 1,000 years, this mountaintop city served as the political, religious, and military heart of Zapotec power. Its plazas, temples, and ball courts were arranged with deliberate geometry, aligned to celestial events and seasonal cycles. But what truly set Monte Alban apart was how openly it displayed violence. Along the city's earliest buildings are stone carvings once thought to depict dancers, twisted, contorted human figures carved in relief. They were called Los Danzantes. They are not dancing. Closer examination reveals mutilation, genital wounds, closed eyes, names and symbols carved beside the bodies. These are captives, enemies defeated, sacrificed, and immortalized in stone. Monte Alban was not content to rule through ritual alone. It ruled through terror, made permanent. Every visitor who entered the plaza walked past these bodies, carved into the very foundations of the city. This was a new phase in Mesoamerican civilization. Where Teotihuacan erased the individual, the Zapotec emphasized domination. Power now had faces, both of rulers and of the conquered. The Zapotec developed one of the earliest writing systems in the Americas, recording military victories and dynastic claims. Their calendar tracked time with precision, and their priests mediated between celestial cycles and earthly authority. Yet even this mountain of power was not eternal. By around 900 CE, Monte Alban began to empty. There is no evidence of invasion, no layers of ash, no mass graves. The city simply lost relevance. Trade routes shifted. Regional rivals emerged. Environmental strain may have eroded agricultural stability. The centralized authority that once held the valleys together fragmented. The Zapotec people did not disappear, but their great mountaintop capital did. Its plazas fell silent. Its carved captives stared forever into empty space, and into that silence stepped another force, one far more militaristic, far more aggressive, and far more wrapped in legend. To the north, in the heart of central Mexico, a culture emerged whose reputation would echo through Aztec myth and Spanish chronicles alike. They were the Toltecs, or perhaps they were something more symbolic than historical. Because separating Toltec reality from Toltec legend is one of the most difficult tasks in American archaeology. What we can say is this: around 950 CE, a powerful state rose from the ruins of earlier civilizations, centered at a city called Tula. Its art is dominated by warriors, eagles, jaguars, and armed figures adorned with atlatls and shields. At the top of Pyramid B stand four massive stone figures, over 15 feet tall. The Atlanteans of Tula. They are not decorative statues. They are load-bearing columns, warriors holding the weight of a temple on their backs. It is architecture turned into ideology. Here, war was not a means to power. It was the foundation of power. The Toltecs refined a god whose influence would shape centuries to come. Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent. In Toltec myth, he appears as a civilizing force, a bringer of knowledge, order, and restraint. But his story ends in betrayal. According to legend, Quetzalcoatl's human incarnation, the ruler Topiltzin-Tse-Acatl Quetzalcoatl, was deceived by darker gods, shamed, and driven from Tula. He sailed east, promising to return. This myth would later haunt the Aztecs and change the course of history. Tula itself fell violently around 1150 CE. The city was burned, its monuments toppled, its people scattered. Internal conflict, drought, and northern invaders likely all played a role. Once again, the cycle repeated. A powerful center rises. It dominates through ritual and force. It collapses under its own weight, and out of its ashes emerges the last and most infamous empire of ancient Mexico. A people who believed the world itself was doomed. A people who built their capital on water, and a people whose fall would be watched by the entire world. The Aztecs are coming. When the Mexica, later known as the Aztecs, entered the Valley of Mexico, they were not heirs to power. They were outsiders, nomads from the north, dismissed by settled peoples as uncultured and dangerous. They arrived late to a land already layered with the ruins of collapsed empires, Teotihuacan, Tula, and countless lesser centers whose ghosts still shape the landscape. But the Mexica understood something their predecessors had learned too late. Myth is power. According to their own history, they wandered for generations under the guidance of their war god Huitzilopochtli, searching for a sign, an eagle perched on a cactus, devouring a serpent. In 1325, they claimed to see it on a small island in the shallow waters of Lake Texcoco. There, against every practical instinct, they chose to build their capital. Tenochtitlan, a city on water. What followed was one of the most rapid ascents in ancient history. Through ruthless warfare, strategic marriages, and carefully constructed alliances, the Aztecs forged a tribute empire that stretched across central Mexico. Within a century, Tenochtitlan became a marvel, a population of over 200,000 people, canals instead of streets, floating gardens, chinampas, that turned swamp into farmland, causeways connecting the island to the mainland, fitted with removable bridges for defense. At the heart of the city rose the Templo Mayor, a massive twin pyramid dedicated to two gods, Tlaloc, lord of rain and fertility, and Huitzilopochtli, god of war and the sun. This dual dedication reveals the core of Aztec worldview: life and death, growth and destruction, balance maintained through blood. For the Aztecs, human sacrifice was not cruelty, it was necessity. They believed the universe itself was fragile, that the sun required nourishment, human hearts and blood, precious water, to rise each day and hold back cosmic darkness. Without sacrifice, the world would end. This belief was not metaphorical, it governed state policy. Wars were waged not only for territory, but for captives. The so-called flower wars were ritualized conflicts designed explicitly to harvest prisoners for the sacrificial stone. At the rededication of the Templo Mayor in 1487, Aztec chronicles claim that thousands, possibly tens of thousands, were sacrificed over 4 days. While the exact numbers are debated, the scale of violence is undeniable. Yet beneath this brutality lay a deeper fear. The Aztecs believed they were living in the fifth sun. Their cosmology described 4 previous worlds, each destroyed by cataclysm: floods, fire, wind, and beasts. The current age, they believed, would end in earthquakes. This was not distant mythology. It was destiny. Every ritual, every sacrifice, every conquest was an attempt to delay the inevitable. This fatalism shaped how the Aztecs interpreted the world, and it would seal their fate. In 1519, when Spanish ships appeared on the eastern horizon, the timing was catastrophic. The year was Tze'acatl in the Aztec calendar, the prophesied year of Quetzalcoatl's return. The Spaniards came from the east. Their leader, Hernán Cortés, bore strange weapons, wore shining armor, and rode animals unknown in the Americas. Emperor Moctezuma II hesitated. Was this an invasion or a fulfillment of prophecy? That hesitation proved fatal. While the Aztecs deliberated, Cortés acted. He forged alliances with indigenous enemies of the empire, peoples crushed under Aztec tribute and sacrifice. Tens of thousands joined the Spaniards, not as followers, but as avengers. Steel, horses, cannons, and old-world diseases did the rest. Smallpox swept through the population, killing leaders, priests, and warriors alike. Within 2 years, Tenochtitlan fell. Its temples were dismantled, its canals filled, its gods were silenced. The last great Mesoamerican empire collapsed in fire and blood. But this was not an ending, it was a rupture. Because as Spanish chroniclers destroyed codices and rewrote history, entire chapters vanished. Knowledge was lost not to time, but to intention. And while the Aztecs fell, other civilizations, far to the south, in landscapes even more extreme, had already mastered power without wheels, iron, or writing. In the towering spine of the Andes, humanity took a different path, one that challenges our very definition of civilization. Long before the Inca ruled the Andes, before gold temples and mountain fortresses, civilization had already taken root on the Pacific coast of South America. Quietly, improbably, and far earlier than anyone once believed. This civilization should not exist. It left no pottery, no monumental statues, no written language, almost no weapons. Yet it built cities. Around 3700 BCE, while the pyramids of Egypt were still centuries away, a culture now known as Norte Chico, or Corral Soup, emerged in the arid river valleys of modern-day Peru. Its greatest city, Corral, sprawled across the desert with massive platform mounds, sunken circular plazas, and carefully planned residential zones. Thousands lived there. Priests ruled, ceremonies were held, astronomical alignments were observed. And astonishingly, there is no evidence of war, no fortifications, no mass graves, no weapons of conquest. This alone defies nearly every model of how early civilizations are supposed to form. Instead of building power through violence, Norte Chico appears to have built it through economics and ritual. The inland cities cultivated cotton and gourds. Along the coast, Fishing villages harvested anchovies and sardines in immense quantities. Cotton nets, essential for fishing, were produced inland and traded for protein-rich seafood. It was a symbiotic system. Religion unified it. The sunken plazas of Corral were likely ceremonial centers, places where sound, movement, and astronomy merged. Recent research suggests these plazas amplified music and chanting, creating powerful sensory experiences that reinforced social cohesion. This was civilization without kings, without armies, without walls. And then, just as quietly as it arose, it vanished. Around 1800 BCE, Corral and its sister cities were abandoned. No signs of invasion, no burning, no collapse through warfare. The leading suspect is climate. A series of powerful El Niño events, earthquakes, and prolonged droughts likely disrupted the fragile balance between inland agriculture and coastal fisheries. When the system failed, people left. Not conquered, not enslaved, simply gone. But the story does not end there. From the high Andes, a new force emerged, one that did not rule through armies or cities, but through belief. Around 900 BCE, pilgrims began traveling to a remote mountain site called Chavin de Huantar. This was not a capital, it was a temple. Chavin was built as a maze, an underground labyrinth of stone corridors, hidden chambers, and acoustic channels. Water flowed beneath the structure, creating thunderous echoes that made the stone itself seem alive. At the heart of the temple stood the Lanzon, a towering granite monolith carved with a terrifying hybrid deity, human, jaguar, serpent, and bird fused into one. Pilgrims entered the darkness. Many were likely under the influence of hallucinogens such as San Pedro cactus, heightening fear and awe. Voices boomed from unseen passages. The gods spoke. Transformation followed. Chavin was not an empire. It was a religious network. Its iconography spread across Peru, unifying distant cultures through shared symbols of power, predation, and cosmic order. This was ideological conquest, and when Chavin faded around 200 BCE, it left behind something crucial, a shared spiritual language. From that language, new cultures would rise. Some would draw lines so vast they could only be seen from the sky. Others would carve cities into mountainsides with surgical precision. One would rule millions without writing a single word. The Andes were not waiting for civilization. They were inventing new versions of it, and the strangest were still to come. As Chavin's religious grip loosened, the Andes did not fall into silence. Instead, belief fractured, splintering into regional identities, each taking fragments of the old sacred language and reshaping it into something new, more localized and far stranger. On the southern coast of Peru, in one of the driest deserts on Earth, a civilization emerged that seemed obsessed with visibility from the sky. They were the Nazca. From around 100 BCE to 800 CE, the Nazca transformed an empty desert into one of the most enigmatic ritual landscapes ever created. They left behind vibrant ceramics, intricate textiles, and severed human heads used as ritual objects. But it is what they etched into the ground that defies easy explanation. The Nazca lines, hundreds of immense geoglyphs carved by removing dark desert stones to reveal lighter earth beneath. Straight lines stretching for miles, spirals, trapezoids, and giant figures, hummingbirds, monkeys, spiders, whales, some over 1,000 feet long. From the ground, they are nearly impossible to recognize. From the air, they are unmistakable. This alone has haunted researchers for decades. Why create art that its makers could never fully see? Early theories ranged wildly, from alien landing strips to giant astronomical calendars. Erich von Däniken famously argued they were signals meant for beings in the sky. Mainstream archaeology rejected that idea, but struggled to offer something more satisfying. The prevailing explanation today is ritual procession. The Nazca likely walked these lines during ceremonies, following prescribed paths as offerings to gods associated with water and fertility. This matters because Nazca survival depended on rain, something painfully scarce in their environment. And here's where the mystery deepens. Beneath the desert, the Nazca engineered an advanced system of underground aqueducts called puquios, spiraling access points leading to subterranean water channels that still function today. They understood hydrology with astonishing precision. Some lines point toward water sources, others align with solar events. A few may track stars, but not all. Many figures seem deliberately symbolic, creatures associated with rain, transformation, and the spirit world. The lines may not have been maps or messages, but offerings, meant not to be seen by humans, but by gods above. If so, the Nazca were building for an audience in the sky, and then, around 800 CE, the Nazca culture collapsed. Evidence suggests prolonged drought combined with ecological mismanagement. Deforestation destabilized the soil, water systems failed, social cohesion broke, the lines remained. A civilization vanished, but its message endured, carved so deeply into the desert that time itself could not erase it. Yet the Andes were not finished producing anomalies. High in the mountains, beyond the desert and the jungle, a new power would rise, one that mastered stone to a degree that still unsettles modern engineers. They would build cities without mortar, walls that flexed during earthquakes, roads that crossed impossible terrain, and they would rule without writing. Their name would become synonymous with lost perfection. The Inca were coming. The rise of the Inca was not slow, and it was not accidental. It was explosive. In the early 15th century, a small highland kingdom centered around the city of Cusco transformed, in less than 100 years, into the largest empire the Americas had ever seen. From southern Colombia to central Chile, from the Pacific coast to the Amazon's edge, over 25,000 miles of roads binding mountains, deserts, and jungles into a single political organism. This empire was called Tawantinsuyu, the four quarters of the world. At its head stood the Sapa Inca, not merely a king, but a living god, a direct descendant of the sun itself. His word was law, his body sacred, his death irrelevant, because the Inca never truly died. Their mummified rulers were preserved, dressed, fed, and consulted long after death. Estates remained in their names. Decisions were made in their presence. The empire was governed not just by the living, but by the accumulated authority of the dead. This alone sets the Inca apart, but their true genius lay in organization. The Inca had no alphabet, no written records, no wheels for transport, no draft animals beyond llamas, yet they administered millions of people. Their solution was the quipu, bundles of knotted strings of different colors, lengths, and materials. For centuries, scholars believed quipus were simple accounting tools, used only to track tribute and census data. But recent studies suggest something far more radical. The knots follow binary logic. Their positions encode variables. Their colors represent categories. Some researchers now believe quipus were capable of recording narratives, histories, laws, even myths. A three-dimensional data system unlike anything else in human history. If true, the Inca created a form of writing that modern scholars are only beginning to decipher, one erased not by decay, but by conquest. Their infrastructure was equally staggering. Stone roads carved into cliff faces, suspension bridges woven from grass fibers strong enough to span deep gorges, relay runners, chasqui, capable of transmitting messages over 150 miles a day, and above all, their stonework. At sites like Cusco, Ollantaytambo, and Machu Picchu, massive stones weighing tens of tons were cut with such precision that a blade cannot be slipped between them. No mortar, no cement, just perfect joins. The walls flex during earthquakes, absorbing seismic energy. Modern engineers still debate how this level of precision was achieved, especially without iron tools or wheeled transport. But perfection did not make the Inca invincible. In the early 1500s, Disaster struck from two directions. First, disease. Smallpox, carried unknowingly by Europeans before any direct contact, ripped through the empire. The emperor died. Succession collapsed. A brutal civil war erupted between two brothers, Atahualpa and Huáscar, shattering unity. Then came the Spaniards. In 1532, Francisco Pizarro arrived with fewer than 200 men. Steel swords, firearms, horses, creatures the Inca had never seen. Through deception, disease, and betrayal, the unthinkable happened. The Sapa Inca was captured. The living god was powerless. Within a generation, Tawantinsuyu was dismantled, temples stripped, gold melted, Quipus destroyed, knowledge erased, but the stones remained, silent, precise, unyielding. And as we leave the Andes behind, one truth becomes unavoidable. Advanced civilization in the Americas did not begin with Columbus. It did not progress in a straight line, and it did not end cleanly. To the north, another great civilization had risen, without stone, without metal, but with earth itself, a city that rivaled London in size, a pyramid larger at its base than Giza, a civilization written out of history for centuries. Next, we journey into the heart of North America, to a metropolis that should not have existed. Cahokia. Long before European sails appeared on the horizon, and far from the stone cities of the Maya or the mountain fortresses of the Inca, a metropolis rose from the soil of North America, built not of stone, but of earth. Its name was Cahokia. Around 1050 CE, on the fertile floodplains of the Mississippi River, directly across from what is now St. Louis, this city exploded into existence, not slowly, not gradually, but rapidly, almost violently, transforming a quiet river landscape into the largest urban center north of Mesoamerica. At its peak, Cahokia was home to 20,000 people, possibly more. That made it larger than London at the time. At the heart of the city stood Monk's Mound, a colossal four-tiered earthen pyramid rising over 100 feet high. Its base covered more ground than the Great Pyramid of Giza. Atop it once stood a massive wooden structure, likely the residence of a paramount ruler, a god-king who governed through ritual authority rather than written law. Cahokia was not a loose settlement. It was planned. Broad plazas radiated outward. Residential zones were organized. Defensive palisades, rebuilt multiple times, enclosed the city's core. Beyond the walls lay suburbs, farms, and satellite communities stretching across hundreds of miles. This was the capital of the Mississippian world. Its influence spread through the river systems like arteries, north to the Great Lakes, south to the Gulf of Mexico, east into the Appalachian foothills. Goods flowed in: copper, shells, stone, mica. Ideas flowed out: mound building, iconography, cosmology. Cahokia's religion centered on the sky. Archaeologists uncovered a series of large timber circles known as woodhenges, arrangements of tall wooden posts aligned with the solstices and equinoxes. From their center, priests could track the sun's movements with precision, regulating planting seasons and ritual calendars. Time itself was part of governance. Power, here, was cosmic. But beneath the order lay something darker. Burials around Cahokia reveal extreme social stratification. Elite graves were filled with exotic goods and sacrificed retainers. One mass grave contained dozens of young women, killed simultaneously, likely ritual offerings tied to political or religious transitions. This was not an egalitarian paradise. It was a tightly controlled theocratic state, and like so many before it, Cahokia fell. Beginning around 1200 CE, the city began to unravel. The population declined. Construction ceased. The palisades were rebuilt more urgently. Environmental stress mounted: deforestation, soil depletion, overhunting. Then came floods, then droughts. The climate cooled as the Little Ice Age approached. Faith in the ruling elite eroded. By 1350, Cahokia was largely abandoned. No conquering army, no foreign invaders. Just a slow collapse of belief, ecology, and order. For centuries, its mounds stood silent, misunderstood. In the 19th century, Americans refused to believe native peoples could have built such a city. They invented a myth of a lost mound builder race. Vikings, Israelites, Atlanteans, anything but indigenous Americans. That myth was racism masquerading as curiosity. The truth is more powerful. Cahokia was built by Native Americans, planned by Native Americans, ruled, worshipped, and abandoned by Native Americans. And it proves something essential. North America was not an empty wilderness. It was a continent of cities, calendars, and kings. As Cahokia faded, other societies endured, some retreating into stone alcoves high above the desert floor, others navigating island chains and open seas. To understand the full scope of America's forgotten civilizations, we must now turn southwest, to a land of canyons, cliffs, and sudden abandonment. The world of the ancestral Puebloans awaits. In the high desert of the American Southwest, where red rock canyons fracture the land and rain is never guaranteed, another civilization mastered survival through precision, patience, and planning. They are known today as the ancestral Puebloans, once called the Anasazi, a name now avoided out of respect for their descendants. For centuries, they transformed an unforgiving landscape into a network of ceremonial centers, engineered roads, and stone cities that clung to cliffs and canyon walls as if grown from the rock itself. Their early heartland lay in Chaco Canyon, in what is now northwestern New Mexico. Between 850 and 1150 CE, Chaco was unlike anything else in North America. It was not a typical village, it was a regional capital. At its center rose monumental great houses like Pueblo Bonito, a D-shaped complex with more than 600 rooms built with carefully shaped stone masonry, multiple stories high. The walls were thick, straight, and aligned with astronomical precision. These structures were not simply homes. They were ceremonial and administrative hubs. Beneath them lay kivas, circular subterranean chambers used for rituals tied to cosmology, ancestry, and seasonal cycles. Some great houses contained massive great kivas, large enough to hold entire communities. Even more astonishing was Chaco's reach. From the canyon radiated a vast system of straight engineered roads, some over 30 feet wide, extending hundreds of miles across mesas, deserts, and mountains. These roads often led to nothing obvious, terminating at shrines, isolated outposts, or horizon points aligned with solar and lunar events. They were not trade roads. They were sacred pathways. Chaco was a place of gathering, a ritual center that coordinated distant communities through belief rather than force. But Chaco was fragile. Its prosperity depended on precise climate conditions and complex water management. When prolonged drought struck in the late 1100s, the system failed. Fields withered. Faith wavered. By 1150 CE, Chaco Canyon was largely abandoned, yet the people did not vanish. They moved north and west to the canyon walls of Mesa Verde in present-day Colorado. Here, they built their most iconic structures, cliff dwellings tucked beneath natural rock overhangs hundreds of feet above canyon floors. Sites like Cliff Palace, Balcony House, and Spruce Tree House are marvels of design. Multi-story stone villages with narrow entrances, defensive positions, and carefully oriented windows that regulate light and temperature. These were not primitive refuges, they were planned communities. But the cliff phase was brief. By 1300 CE, Mesa Verde was also abandoned. No signs of invasion, no mass destruction, no final battle, just departure. Modern archaeology points to a combination of severe drought, resource stress, and social transformation. Oral traditions of the Hopi and Zuni peoples speak of this era as a time of migration, a necessary journey guided by spiritual law. The Puebloans did not disappear. They became the living cultures of the Southwest today. What remains mysterious is not that they left, but how completely they did. Entire cities emptied, homes sealed, sacred spaces left intact. It was not collapse, it was withdrawal. And it reminds us of a recurring pattern across the Americas. Civilizations did not always end in fire and blood. Sometimes they simply walked away. To the east, across rivers and forests, other societies were navigating water rather than stone, linking islands, coasts, and continents. To follow that thread, we must now leave the deserts behind and sail into turquoise seas. The Caribbean awaits. Beyond the deserts and mountains of the mainland lies a different world entirely. A constellation of islands scattered across warm blue waters, bound together not by roads or walls, but by canoes and currents. This was the world of the Caribbean before Columbus. Far from being isolated or primitive, the islands were home to complex seafaring societies who understood the ocean as a living highway. They navigated by stars, winds, and tides, maintaining networks of trade, warfare, and belief that stretched hundreds of miles. The most widespread of these peoples were the Taino. By around 1200 CE, Taino societies dominated the Greater Antilles, modern Cuba, Hispaniola, Puerto Rico, and Jamaica. They lived in organized villages centered on open plazas, ruled by hereditary chiefs known as caciques. These were not simple settlements. Taino villages were carefully planned. Houses were arranged in circular patterns around ceremonial courts called batais, where ritual ball games were played, games strikingly similar to those of Mesoamerica, suggesting long-distance cultural exchange. Their spiritual world revolved around zamis, powerful ancestral and nature spirits embodied in carved stone, wood, or bone figures. These zamis governed rain, fertility, storms, and fate itself. Chiefs derived authority not just from lineage, but from their ability to mediate with these forces. The Taino were master agriculturists and sailors. They cultivated cassava, maize, sweet potatoes, and cotton. Their massive dugout canoes, some capable of carrying over 100 people, enabled regular travel between islands and along the mainland coast. But they were not alone. To the south and east lived the Carib, or Kalinago, a more militarized seafaring people who raided rival islands and fiercely resisted outside domination. Spanish chroniclers portrayed them as savage cannibals, a label now widely understood as propaganda used to justify enslavement and extermination. In reality, the Carib were skilled navigators, traders, and warriors defending their autonomy. When Columbus arrived in 1492, he did not encounter an untouched paradise. He encountered a thriving, interconnected maritime world, and he destroyed it. Within decades, disease, forced labor, and violence reduced Taino populations by as much as 90%. Entire cultures collapsed in silence. Languages vanished. Oral histories were severed. But not everything disappeared. Beneath the waves, the Caribbean hides a deeper mystery, one that predates European contact by thousands of years. Off the coast of Bimini, in the Bahamas, lies a strange underwater formation discovered in 1968. A linear arrangement of massive limestone blocks stretching for half a mile. It is known as the Bimini Road. To geologists, it is a natural formation, fractured beach rock shaped by erosion. To others, its right angles, stacked blocks, and apparent cornerstones suggest something else entirely. A harbour wall, a causeway, a remnant of a drowned coastline. Its discovery electrified the world because it appeared to fulfill a prophecy by Edgar Cayce, who claimed remnants of Atlantis would be found near Bimini in the late 1960s. Mainstream science remains skeptical. But the Bimini Road is not alone. Across the Caribbean, divers and sonar scans have reported submerged terraces, stone circles, and geometric anomalies. Most controversially, a deep water site off the western coast of Cuba, where sonar revealed what appeared to be pyramidal and circular structures more than 2,000 feet below the surface. If natural, they are extraordinary. If artificial, they are impossible, unless they were built when sea levels were far lower. That would place them near the end of the last ice age, and suddenly, the Caribbean is no longer just a chain of islands. It becomes a graveyard, a place where coastlines vanished, where cities may have drowned, where memory sank beneath rising seas. To understand that possibility, we must now widen our lens, beyond islands and continents, beyond local cultures. We must return to the oceans themselves, because the Americas were not as isolated as we were taught, and the proof lies in ships that crossed before Columbus, from the frozen north, from the far Pacific, and from the heart of Africa itself. For centuries, the Atlantic Ocean was portrayed as an unbroken wall, a vast, impassable void separating the old world from the new. That illusion did not survive the 20th century. Because in the windswept north of Newfoundland, on the edge of the Arctic, archaeologists uncovered something that shattered the Columbus myth forever: a Viking settlement. At L'Anse-aux-Meadows, excavated in the 1960s, researchers found the unmistakable remains of Norse longhouses, iron-working furnaces, and everyday tools. In 2021, tree ring dating fixed the moment precisely, the year 1021 CE. Nearly 500 years before Columbus, Europeans had already reached the Americas. This was Vinland, described in the Icelandic sagas, a land of timber, fish, and danger. Leif Erikson and his companions did not discover an empty shore. They encountered people the Norse called Skraelings, indigenous inhabitants who resisted them fiercely. The settlement was temporary. The Norse withdrew, but the implication was permanent. The Atlantic could be crossed. And once that door opened, older questions returned with new force. Were the Vikings the first, or merely the last to leave evidence? One of the most controversial challenges to the standard timeline is the Solutrean hypothesis. Between 22,000 and 17,000 years ago, during the height of the Ice Age, a culture known as the Solutreans lived in what is now France and Spain. They produced exquisitely crafted stone tools, thin, symmetrical, leaf-shaped spear points made using advanced pressure flaking techniques. Strikingly similar tools appear in early North American sites like Cactus Hill in Virginia and Meadowcroft Rock Shelter in Pennsylvania. Dated to 16,000 to 20,000 years ago, predating Clovis, the hypothesis proposes a radical scenario. Ice Age hunters followed the edge of the North Atlantic Sea ice in skin boats, exploiting a rich marine ecosystem of seals, fish, and seabirds, eventually reaching North America from Europe, not Asia, not a single voyage, a migration corridor. Mainstream archaeology rejects this idea, citing genetic evidence linking Native Americans overwhelmingly to Asia. But one anomaly refuses to disappear: mitochondrial DNA haplogroup X2A. It appears almost exclusively in Native American populations, especially around the Great Lakes. Yet its closest relatives are found not in Siberia, but in Europe and the Near East. Scientists argue this lineage could have arrived with Asian migrants and later vanished from Siberia. Critics respond, that explanation feels forced. The Solutrean hypothesis remains radioactive, partly because it has been misused by white nationalist groups seeking to rewrite American origins. That political contamination has made serious discussion almost impossible. But the tools remain, the dates remain, the questions remain. Beyond Europe, another Atlantic legend blurs the line between myth and memory. In the 6th century, an Irish monk named Saint Brendan was said to have sailed west in a leather-covered boat on a 7-year voyage described in the Navigatio Sancti Brendani. The account reads like fantasy: crystal pillars rising from the sea, islands of fire, great whales mistaken for land. But in 1976, explorer Tim Severin rebuilt Brendan's boat using period materials and sailed it successfully from Ireland to Newfoundland. What was once dismissed as allegory became plausible. Supporting evidence is thin and controversial: petroglyphs, inscriptions, linguistic echoes, but the voyage itself is no longer impossible. And then there are the shadows, the Knights Templar. When the order was violently suppressed in 1307, their fleet vanished from European records. Legends claim they fled with sacred relics, perhaps even the Holy Grail. Some believe they crossed the Atlantic. The Newport Tower in Rhode Island, a strange stone structure unlike colonial architecture, has been cited as evidence. Carbon dating places it in the 1600s, but proponents argue it was built atop older foundations. Nearby, the Oak Island Money Pit, a booby-trapped shaft that has consumed centuries of treasure hunters, has been linked to Templars, Freemasons, and lost archives. There is no proof, but there is persistence. From Vikings to monks to phantom knights, the Atlantic begins to look less like a barrier and more like a corridor, one crossed sporadically, quietly, and then forgotten. Yet the most audacious Atlantic voyage of all may not have come from Europe. It may have come from Africa, and it involved a king who gave up everything to sail into the unknown. Nearly 2 centuries before Columbus, before caravels and crowns, before the myth of European discovery hardened into doctrine, an African king did something no ruler had ever dared. He walked away from power. His name was Abu Bakr II, Emperor of the Mali Empire, one of the richest and most sophisticated states on earth in the early 14th century. Mali was not a marginal kingdom. It controlled vast gold reserves, dominated trans-Saharan trade, and ruled from great cities like Timbuktu, where astronomers, mathematicians, and scholars studied the heavens while Europe staggered through the early Middle Ages. And Abu Bakr II was obsessed with one question: what lies beyond the Western Ocean? Arab historian al-Umari, writing in the 1300s, recorded the account after speaking directly with Abu Bakr's successor, Mansa Musa, the wealthiest man in recorded history. Musa described how his predecessor launched an unprecedented expedition into the Atlantic, what Arab sailors called the Sea of Darkness. The first expedition consisted of 200 ships, half filled with men, half with supplies. Abu Bakr ordered them to sail west and not return unless they reached the far shore. Only one ship came back. Its captain told of a terrifying phenomenon: a powerful river in the ocean that pulled ship after ship into its current, dragging them westward until they vanished. This was not superstition. It is an almost perfect description of the Canary Current and the North Equatorial Current, the same oceanic conveyor belt that would later carry Columbus to the Caribbean. Where most rulers would have stopped, Abu Bakr saw confirmation. He abdicated the throne. In 1312, he handed the empire to Mansa Musa and personally led a second expedition, this time reportedly involving 2,000 ships, and sailed west. He was never seen again. Official history ends there. But if we follow the currents, the story may not. A fleet launched from West Africa would have been carried naturally toward Brazil, the Caribbean, or the Gulf of Mexico. The voyage was not only possible, it was probable. And then, there is Columbus. On his third voyage, Columbus recorded something strange in his journals. The indigenous people of Hispaniola told him that black-skinned people had come from the south and southeast in large canoes, trading spear points made of a gold alloy called guanin. Columbus sent samples of this metal back to Spain. Analysis revealed an exact match to West African metallurgy, an alloy of gold, silver, and copper used in Mali. Coincidence? There is more. Botanical evidence shows African crops, such as the bottle gourd, present in the Americas long before Columbus. Linguistic parallels have been proposed between Mandinka words and terms found in Mesoamerican languages. Early European explorers described dark-skinned indigenous groups in Panama and Colombia referred to as Black Guineans. And then there are the faces. The Olmec colossal heads, carved more than 2,000 years before Abu Bakr II, display broad noses, full lips, and helmeted features that many observers, since the 19th century, have described as unmistakably African. Mainstream archaeology insists these are stylized representations of indigenous rulers. Yet the question refuses to die. If African contact occurred once, could it have happened more than once? Abu Bakr's voyage, documented by contemporary historians, is not myth. It is record. What happened after he sailed west is the silence. No wrecks, no settlements conclusively identified, no chronicles preserved in European archives. But silence does not mean absence. History has a way of erasing stories that do not fit its hierarchy. The idea that Africans reached the Americas before Columbus, organized, intentional, state-sponsored, would shatter centuries of colonial mythology. It would overturn narratives of European exceptionalism. It would force a rewriting of who explored whom. And so Abu Bakr II became a footnote, a curiosity, a king who vanished. But perhaps his fleet did not vanish at all. Perhaps it arrived. And if so, then the Americas were not merely discovered or stumbled upon. They were sought, crossed, reached, again and again, from the Atlantic, from the Pacific, from the heart of Africa. And now, as we widen the lens once more, another ocean demands our attention, the largest on Earth. Because the Pacific too was crossed, and this time the proof is written not in stone or myth, but in DNA. For most of modern history, the Pacific Ocean was treated as a dead end in human migration, a vast, empty barrier separating Asia from the Americas, crossed only once by chance through a frozen land bridge. That belief no longer holds, because the Pacific was not a wall, it was a road, and the people who mastered it were among the greatest navigators humanity has ever produced. They were the Polynesians. Long before compasses, sextants, or maps, Polynesian wayfinders settled a triangle of ocean larger than all the continents combined, stretching from Hawaii to Rapa Nui, Easter Island, to Aotearoa, New Zealand. They navigated by stars, wave patterns, cloud formations, bird flight paths, and the color of the sea itself. Their double-hulled canoes were engineering marvels, capable of carrying families, livestock, and plants across thousands of miles of open ocean. For decades, scholars assumed their voyages stopped at the eastern edge of Polynesia. Then a problem appeared: the sweet potato. This plant is native to South America, specifically the Andean region, yet it was widespread throughout Polynesia centuries before European contact. Even more puzzling, the Polynesian word for sweet potato, kumara, closely resembles words used by indigenous peoples of Peru and Ecuador. Plants do not cross oceans by accident. Names do not align by chance. For years the debate raged: did South Americans drift west, or did Polynesians sail east? In 1947, Thor Heyerdahl sailed the Kon-Tiki, proving that a raft could drift from Peru to Polynesia. But this experiment demonstrated only possibility, not probability. The real answer came much later. In 2020, a landmark genetic study analyzed DNA from over 800 individuals across Polynesia and the Pacific coast of the Americas. The result was unambiguous. There was direct genetic admixture between Polynesians and Native Americans, dating to around 1200 CE. Not accidental drift, not post-Columbian contamination. A planned encounter. The genetic signal traced specifically to indigenous groups from what is now Colombia, perfectly matching the ocean currents Polynesian sailors would have followed. This means Polynesians reached South America. They interacted, they intermarried, they returned home. And they carried with them not only the sweet potato, but American genes, which then spread across Polynesia. This was a round-trip voyage across the largest ocean on Earth using Stone Age technology. The implications are staggering. If Polynesians could do this once, they could have done it more than once. And if contact occurred in the 1200s, it may not have been the first. The Pacific becomes not an empty void, but a dynamic exchange zone. Ideas, plants, people, moving back and forth long before Columbus. And suddenly, a larger picture comes into focus. The Americas were not isolated. They were connected, sporadically, unevenly, but undeniably, across ice, across oceans, across millennia. From Viking ships in the north, to Polynesian canoes in the south, to African fleets riding Atlantic currents, the New World was touched, visited, and perhaps known, again and again. Which brings us to the most dangerous question of all. If contact happened, if civilizations met, exchanged knowledge, and then vanished, what erased those connections? What catastrophe was powerful enough to wipe coastlines clean, drown cities, and reduce global networks to myth? To answer that, we must confront the legend humanity has argued about for over 2,000 years, a place swallowed by the sea, a civilization lost in a single night, Atlantis, and whether it was myth or memory. Of all the stories humanity has carried across time, none is more controversial or more revealing than the legend of Atlantis. For centuries, it has been dismissed as fiction, a philosophical metaphor, a moral warning invented by Plato. But when stripped of modern prejudice, Atlantis begins to look less like fantasy and more like memory. Around 360 BCE, Plato recorded the tale in Timaeus and Critias. He claimed the story was far older, preserved by Egyptian priests, and passed to the Greek lawgiver Solon. According to them, Atlantis was a powerful maritime civilization located beyond the Pillars of Hercules, the Strait of Gibraltar. It was rich, technologically advanced, globally connected, and it was destroyed in a single, catastrophic event. In one day and one night of misfortune, by earthquakes and floods, sinking beneath the sea. The most important detail is the date. Plato places the destruction 9,000 years before Solon. That equals approximately 9,600 BCE. For generations, scholars mocked this number. Then geology caught up. Modern science now knows that 9,600 BCE falls exactly at the end of the Younger Dryas, a period of abrupt global climate change marked by rapid melting of ice sheets, sudden sea level rise, massive flooding of coastlines worldwide. Entire continental shelves disappeared. Coastal cities, if they existed, would now lie underwater. And suddenly, Plato's timeline no longer looks absurd. It looks precise. With this in mind, attention turned west, to the Caribbean. In 1968, divers off the coast of Bimini discovered a half-mile line of massive limestone blocks arranged in a strikingly linear formation, the Bimini Road. Mainstream geologists insist it is a natural beach rock formation, but others point to right-angle joints, stacked stone patterns, apparent cornerstones, and its discovery coincided eerily with a prediction by Edgar Cayce, who claimed remnants of Atlantis would be found near Bimini in the late 1960s. Coincidence? Or coincidence layered on coincidence? The mystery deepened in 2001, when sonar scans off the western coast of Cuba revealed something far stranger. At depths of over 2,000 feet, researchers detected geometric structures resembling pyramids, circular buildings, grid-like arrangements spread across several square miles. If natural, they are unprecedented. If artificial, they are impossible unless they were built when sea levels were far lower. Which again points to the end of the last ice age. Funding vanished. Follow-up expeditions stalled. The story faded, but echoes remain. Across the Americas, ancient cities mirror Atlantis in unsettling ways. Tenochtitlan, an island capital with canals as streets. Poverty Point, massive concentric earthworks in Louisiana. Cusco, a city laid out in symbolic geometry, and everywhere, the same myth. A previous world, advanced, corrupt, destroyed by flood. The Maya spoke of earlier creations wiped away. The Hopi described worlds lost beneath water. The Andes told of giants erased by deluge. These are not isolated stories. They are fragments, which raises a forbidden possibility. Atlantis was not a single island. It was a coastal world, a global maritime civilization of the late Ice Age, its cities now drowned, its survivors remembered as gods and culture bringers. Quetzalcoatl, Viracocha, Oannes, figures who arrived from the sea after catastrophe, bringing knowledge, law, and architecture to shattered inland societies. Mainstream archaeology calls this myth-making. But myth is often history that survived trauma. If a global catastrophe erased coastlines, drowned cities, and shattered long-distance networks, what would remain? Inland settlements, oral traditions, stone monuments built later in memory, not proof. Echoes. Atlantis may not be waiting to be found intact. It may already be found, broken into myths, scattered across oceans, buried beneath rising seas. And if that is true, then the greatest loss in human history was not a city. It was memory itself. Which brings us to the final question. If so much has been forgotten, why? Why were these stories dismissed, ridiculed, buried? The answer lies not in ancient times, but in modern power. And that is where our journey ends. If the past were only forgotten by time, it could be forgiven. But much of what we've explored was not simply lost, it was actively erased. The final layer of this story is not about ancient ruins or vanished fleets, but about who controls history and why certain versions of the past are allowed to survive while others are quietly suffocated. The first great act of suppression began with conquest. When the Spanish arrived in the Americas, they did not just seize land and gold, they dismantled memory. To justify enslavement and extermination, indigenous civilizations had to be reframed as primitive, pagan, and incapable of true knowledge. This required destruction. In 1562, Bishop Diego de Landa ordered the burning of nearly all Maya codices, books containing astronomy, mathematics, history, and cosmology. He later admitted, almost casually, that these texts held knowledge the Spaniards could not understand. What burned was not superstition, it was science. Similar fates befell Aztec and Inca records. Quipu's were destroyed, oral historians were silenced, sacred sites were repurposed or buried beneath churches. What survived was filtered, translated through colonial eyes. The result was a historical vacuum, and vacuums invite narratives. In the 18th and 19th centuries, as archaeology became institutionalized, it inherited this colonial framework. European scholars approached the Americas with a fixed assumption. Civilization flowed outward from Europe. Anything that contradicted this had to be reinterpreted or dismissed. This is why the mound builder myth was invented. When Americans encountered Cahokia and the Ohio Valley earthworks, they refused to believe native peoples built them. Instead, they proposed a lost white race, Phoenicians, Israelites, Vikings, anyone but indigenous Americans. Ironically, when evidence later proved native origins, academia swung hard in the opposite direction, becoming fiercely defensive against any suggestion of pre-Columbian contact. Dogma replaced curiosity. This pattern repeated in the 20th century. The Clovis first model became untouchable. Researchers who proposed older dates, like Virginia Steen McIntyre at Valsequillo, found their careers stalled, papers blocked, funding withdrawn. Not because the data was flawed, but because it was disruptive. Institutions do not collapse gracefully. They defend themselves. Museums are cautious. Journals are conservative. Universities reward compliance. Evidence that threatens foundational narratives becomes fringe by default. And into that silence stepped outsiders, authors, podcasters, independent researchers. Some were careful, some were reckless. But the public listened, not because they rejected science, but because science refused to engage. The result was polarization, either total dismissal or total belief. Nuance vanished. Complicating matters further are modern politics. Indigenous identity, land claims, and sovereignty are deeply tied to being first. Meanwhile, extremist groups have weaponized theories like the Solutrean hypothesis to promote racist agendas. This has poisoned legitimate inquiry. Any discussion of ancient contact risks being misused, and so it is avoided altogether. Safer to say nothing, but silence has a cost. It fractures our understanding of humanity. It isolates cultures that were once connected. It turns a rich, shared past into competing narratives. The truth is likely uncomfortable. The Americas were neither isolated nor overwritten by a single narrative. They were shaped by multiple waves of people, across multiple oceans, across deep time. Acknowledging that does not diminish indigenous civilizations. It elevates them. It places them at the center of a global human story, not as passive recipients, but as active participants in a world far more interconnected than we were taught. The suppression, then, is not a single conspiracy. It is a system, a convergence of colonial legacy, institutional inertia, political fear, and intellectual risk aversion. And it leaves us with a choice. We can accept a simplified past, or we can sit with complexity. We can demand certainty, or we can allow mystery, which brings us to the final moment of this journey. Not a conclusion, but a reckoning, because the past is not finished with us yet. And the question now is not what was lost, but whether we are finally ready to listen. As the night deepens and the noise of the modern world fades, we are left alone with a single, unsettling realization. The history of the Americas is not finished being written. What we have uncovered is not a neat alternative timeline, not a replacement myth meant to overthrow another. It is something far more uncomfortable and far more human. A past that is fragmented. A past that survives not as certainty, but as echo. We followed footprints older than any civilization should allow. We stood before cities that rose without war and vanished without fire. We traced stone roads through deserts, knots through empires, and genes across oceans. We listened to myths that refuse to die, because they remember something we have forgotten. Again and again, the same pattern emerged. Humanity was never still, never isolated, never confined to a single origin or a single direction. People crossed ice, sailed currents, followed stars, and rebuilt after catastrophe. Not once, but repeatedly. And when disaster struck, when seas rose, climates shifted, empires fell, knowledge did not disappear all at once. It broke. Some fragments became architecture. Some became ritual. Some became stories told at night to children who no longer knew where those stories came from. And some were buried, intentionally or not, by those who needed the past to be simpler than it truly was. This is the real tragedy. Not that Atlantis may have sunk, not that fleets vanished or cities drowned, but that complexity frightened us. It was easier to believe in isolation, easier to believe in linear progress, easier to believe history began when we arrived. Yet the stones disagree, the DNA disagrees, the myths disagree. They whisper the same truth across continents and millennia. We have been here before. We have risen before. We have fallen before. And each time, something survives. Not empires, not names, but questions. Questions about who we are, where we came from, and how much we've already forgotten. Perhaps the greatest danger is not that these mysteries exist. It is that we rush to either believe them blindly or dismiss them entirely. Truth rarely lives at either extreme. It lives in the tension, in the willingness to say, we don't know yet, and to keep looking anyway. So as you drift towards sleep, let this story remain unfinished. Let Abu Bakr's ships stay on the horizon. Let the Nazca lines remain messages without recipients. Let the stones beneath the Caribbean stay silent, for now. Because history does not demand belief. It demands curiosity. And the Americas, far older, deeper, and more connected than we were taught, are still whispering. Not asking us to rewrite the past, only asking us to listen more carefully this time.